Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. That was meant to be a slideshow of a few different classes, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to control that once I started screen sharing, but we will start offering some slides to let you know about a few classes coming up that are brand new for the spring semester. So hopefully we'll work that out by next time. But I wanted to introduce you to our two directors tonight, Bonni Cohen and Jon Shenk. We're going to be discussing their Netflix original documentary, Athlete A, which is currently available on Netflix. Their bios have a decent amount of overlap, so I'll try not to repeat too much information. I did cut them down a little bit, so hopefully Bonni and Jon will forgive me. Bonni Cohen has produced and directed an array of award-winning films. She co-directed An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, with Jon Shenk, which was selected to be the opening night film of the 2017 Sundance Film Festival and shortlisted for the 2018 Oscars. In 2016, Bonni co-directed the Peabody Award-winning film AUDRIE DAISY, which premiered in competition at the 2016 Sundance Film Festival and was picked up as a Netflix original film. Bonni served as a producer on The Island President, producer and director on The Rape of Europa, and served as a producer on John Els's Sundance film Wonders Are Many, and together with Els co-directed Inside Guantanamo. Jon Shenk has directed and photographed many award-winning films, including the Peabody Award-winning film Audrey and Daisy, and he directed The Island President, winner of TIFF's People's Choice Award and the IDA's Per Lawrence Award. Jon was awarded the 2004 Independent Spirit Award for directing Lost Boys of Sudan, and was the DP for the 2008 Academy Award-winning Smile Pinky. He also won an Emmy for Blame Somebody Else in 2007. So please welcome our two guests, Bonni Cohen and Jon Shenk.
Hi, thanks for having us.
There's a major aircraft flying overhead, so I apologize.
No worries. There was a major power outage on my block, and I was going to have to go to USC to do this. Luckily, the power's back. And I wouldn't have had access to my office, so I was already imagining all the shenanigans going on in the background.
Well, I'm glad it worked out.
Yes, me too. So thank you so much for joining us. And, you know, this is a film that, of course, touches on a subject matter that USC has also lived through in a very brutal way in the past several years, as we've learned about a lot of very similar misconduct perpetrated against the women of our university by the gynecologist here. So I'm really glad that we can have this conversation, and we can sort of unpack a lot of the things that institutions do when covering up these horrible stories that are being related to them, whether firsthand or not, by victims of abuse. Can you talk a bit about what led you to this story? I mean, what was the spark that first brought it to your attention, but then actually made you feel like there was a feature film to be made?
We had made Audrey and Daisy, as you mentioned in our bios, which was in 2016, which was a film about high school sexual assault, two young girls who were assaulted by boys they thought were their friends, and then bullied on social media subsequently. And we had been immersed in that for a couple of years, and the film was on Netflix. It was sort of, we did a huge outreach campaign. There was a lot of time that we spent creating advocacy and trying to get some of the people in the film involved in getting out there and providing help, etc. So we had a little bit of a name for ourselves developing in that world. And through one of our now producers on the film, Julie Parker Bonello, who was involved with American Factory last year, and she does a lot of producing across narratives and docs, introduced us to Jennifer Say, who was the 1986 US champion in gymnastics, and in 2008 came out with her own book called Chalked Up, which was about all of the psychological and physical abuses inside of USA Gymnastics and the gyms around the country. That was sort of, a blind eye was turned to that during her tenure as a gymnast, and she was kind of excoriated at the time when she put the book out. And when the Nassar story was breaking in 2016, she approached us through Julie Parker Bonello, having been a fan of Audrey and Daisy, and started talking to us about the sort of fusing those two ideas, the idea of this Nassar case, this sexual assault, the sexual predator inside of USA Gymnastics, and how did that happen? How was that allowed to happen? And what were the ways in which the psychological and physical abuses that were happening in the gyms across the country for so many decades in this sport, how did that really kind of set the bed for someone like Nassar to be able to succeed? And that started to get Jon and I really interested in how there was this institution, unlike other institutions, the Catholic Church, university settings. There are places where these kinds of organizational settings allow for this kind of abuse, and we wanted to dig into that. So with Jen Say as a partner, a producing partner, and someone who was able to really introduce us to a lot of insiders in the gymnastics world, we set about trying to figure out how to tell the larger story.
I'm curious to know a little bit about the timeline of where you entered the story as well, because obviously there's a lot of contemporary interviews with the women that came forward and the people that are part of their communities. But since we go all the way through the trial, I'm curious if you came in at the end, in the middle, in the beginning. How involved were you in terms of the timeline?
That's an excellent, very perceptive question. It actually ends up being quite important to the process that we had. We first started thinking about this film early to mid 2017. Which at that time, Nassar had been arrested, but not yet tried and sentenced. And so we were kind of in the middle of this breaking story. I mean, the country, there had been national news that there had been a doctor arrested, that had worked at USA Gymnastics. But really the kind of mega news that it became had not yet happened yet. That was in early 2018 during the sentencing, which you see in the film, that amazing scene where all the women stood up, who were his victims, stood up and made testimony about, before he was sentenced by the court. And it actually ended up, the timing of our kind of getting into the story ended up being quite an important thing for us, because timeline in general became quite complex in this film. We had this ongoing contemporary story to tell that is partly told in cinema verite. We follow the news reporters in the newsroom as they're gathering information and writing new articles. And then we had this kind of recent history to tell about, how this all came to be, specifically the Nassar arrest and all that kind of thing. And then, of course, Maggie Nichols had this other kind of sort of semi-contemporary story, but also recent history to tell. And then at one point, Bonni and I realized, like, oh my God, we can't do this film without really kind of diving back into history and talking about how we got here. What is the history of the gymnastics in the U.S. Olympic movement? And so we had to go back to the 1970s and really tell that history about how Bella Caroli came to the United States, the famous gymnastics coach who started in Romania as an Eastern European coach. So I don't mean to give such a long-winded answer to your question about how when we got involved, but it actually ended up kind of having a big influence on the structure of the film, and a lot of teeth gnashing about how we were going to put this thing together in the end.
So when did we come to the story?
I said early to mid 2017 is when we started.
Early to mid, yeah, that's right.
I think our first shoot was in the late summer of 17 in the newsroom.
Right, that's right. So the Indianapolis Star reporters had already reported their first couple of stories about Nassar. There was ongoing coverage. They're in Indianapolis, which is the town where USA Gymnastics is based. So it's a hometown story, and they wanted to stick to it as long as there was funding for them to do so.
So were you then already working with some of your subjects, I mean, particularly Maggie, while the case is still unfolding?
Yeah. We actually went to see Maggie compete before we started even filming with her, or talking to her about the film. We went to see her compete at UCLA. Oklahoma was playing UCLA, competing against UCLA. It was magnificent to see her as an athlete, see her athleticism, and we could tell how different her experience was right then, in the NCAA versus the elite gymnastics movement. So yeah, it took a while to convince her to get involved with the film. She had some press around when she went public, but it's a hard thing to do, to tell this particular story, and to do it that quickly in terms of like her own history, thinking about what had happened to her and having any kind of analysis of it. It was a lot to ask of her, but she really rose, and she's a warrior. Her whole family really they're seeking justice.
What would you say were the key things that you established with her that made it a situation that she felt comfortable and could trust you to tell this story?
It was important that who else was in the film. It was important to her that we had some of these other key players. Rachel Denhollander, who was, very key for her, because she was kind of like they referred to her as kind of like the 4-star general of all of the Nassar victims. Jamie Dancher, 2000 Olympian. We were talking to other members of her team, people who were on the national team with her, and she had a lot of respect for Jen Say and the work that she had already done. All of that was sort of cumulatively part of her decision making, and I think her parents also pushed her to think about how important it would be for her to step forward. So, John, what am I missing? Those seem to be kind of the key things that brought.
Yeah, and also the another key. I mean, there's so many key things, and I don't mean to diminish anything that Bonni said, because they're all important. But another kind of key thing for us was our relationship with John Manley, who is the attorney for the vast majority of the Nassar survivors, and just an amazing kind of character in the film, but also an amazing guy in real life, who had successfully prosecuted a Catholic Church case earlier in his career. And by the time we met, I think actually that one of the reasons we heard about Maggie was through John, because she wasn't public yet about who she was in relation to Nassar when we first started thinking about casting her, so to speak, in the film. But of course it became hugely important to get her in the film, because we just felt like that early whistleblowing that she did a year before Nassar was even known to the public was just so crucial to the unwinding of that story.
And how corrupt it was, because from her timeline versus the public timeline, basically USA Gymnastics did very little. They knew about it. They knew about Nassar. They waited 5 weeks to tell the FBI about Nassar. There really wasn't anything done. Maggie reported in June of 2015, and it wasn't until the following, really right before Olympic trials, that anything started to happen. So, it was very important, not only in terms of the Nassar story, but in terms of trying to prove the corrupt attitude that USA Gymnastics had towards all of this, and the blind eye that they were turning to the abuse, so to be able to show those timelines butted up against each other.
Well, what we see in the film, I think that's really quite amazing, is that once there are some people with the courage to take the first steps, then you see a space opened for others to tell their stories. I'm curious if that affected the casting for your film at all, if as things were sort of developing, a greater sense of this could potentially be an opportunity to bring this person to justice, if that meant that other people were like getting in touch with you, if there were other stories that, you know, people were trying to tell you, how did that evolve?
Well, we had I think for the first time in our filmmaking, we had kind of like in our office, we had kind of like a murder board on the wall, you know, with like literally like strings and tape and pictures and stuff. And because it was such a complex story that had gone back decades, really, we felt like we had to kind of get our heads around the history. And then, and of course we were just so frustrated, like, how do we tell all this stuff? There's just so much stuff. And we had a key moment, I think. We were kind of just starting to edit, but we were also still shooting. And we kind of realized we really need to tell the story of everybody who actually had a direct impact on bringing Nassar to first to public and then ultimately to justice. And so it was, to answer your question, it was a little bit of kind of a winnowing down, you know, because there are hundreds of Nassar survivors. Unfortunately, he was one of the most quote unquote successful child predators of all time, and at least that we know about. And you know, there's so many, and within that, there's so many brave people who've stepped up and really become amazing figures. But you know, starting with the Indianapolis Star reporters, and then very quickly getting to Rachel, Jamie Dancher, and Jessica Howard, who called the Indy Star after that first Nassar report, and of course Maggie, kind of in her own universe, whistleblowing from the inside. We felt like that was sort of our inner circle, and then we kind of would build out from there to the cops and the lawyers who helped them prosecute their case.
Plus, if any one of those people had not done exactly what they had done, I mean, it was such a house of cards on the one hand, but it was also still so easy to let it continue, you know? So that was part of our consideration, as Jon sort of very nicely lays out. That was sort of the structural, that was the scaffolding for showing how important it was that each one of those specific people were involved in bringing this system down.
We started seeing the film as almost like a relay race, like literally, like, you know, one person would take the story and then hand the baton, and then somebody else would kind of run with the story. And then we started thinking, well, okay, we need everybody who held that baton until Nassar went away and USA Gymnastics started to fall apart as an organization.
Is there much in terms of the Olympics, the IOC responding to the US team? I mean, I know that it's obviously yet another organization and certainly no stranger to corruption themselves, but I'm curious if there's any action being taken beyond what's already happened.
Well, there's tons of stuff going on in the space. There actually was a law passed during all this in the U.S. Congress. Believe it or not, there was some bipartisan support that went on during the Trump administration. Congress actually got together and passed a law on increasing safety and human rights for amateur athletes and Olympic athletes in the country. The jury is out on what it's going to actually mean within the Olympic movement, and whether the Olympic Committee themselves kind of takes it on to push that.
There were a variety of people that were fired from the USOC, the U.S. Olympic Committee, in response to this, but it was not enough. It has never been enough, and there really hasn't been. I mean, what we're realizing as we're doing the outreach for the film, and a lot more Olympians from around the world are coming forward. It's just becoming clearer and clearer that there isn't a human rights consideration in the kind of the doctrine of the IOC. It's not baked into what they do, what they provide their athletes. And, you know, there's an opportunity right now to make those changes, because, you know, there's no Olympics, obviously, this year. This film was supposed to drop right at the time of the Tokyo Olympics. And, you know, this respite now is an opportunity for them to actually listen to the athletes and make some change. And we're trying to use the film to help promote these ideas of bringing these human rights considerations smack into what the Olympics needs to provide for their athletes. Not enough has been done is the short answer.
I'm really, really glad that in the time that it took between when you shot and when you distributed the film, that we were able to see how Maggie's career had turned around. I mean, what an amazing ending to such a difficult, arduous story, to see her winning the championships with the NCAA and Oklahoma. I'm curious if, I guess I'm curious if there's anything about her life that has changed since the film has been released, because a lot of times, as we've seen in your film, but really in any situation of a publicized sexual assault accusal, the victim is consistently harassed, trolled, demeaned, vilified, and if the court, if the actual verdict and then the film coming out publicizing the verdict and all of the wrongdoings have offered any measure of respite to the victims of the crimes, or if they're only continuing to get the sort of the you know, hateful messages, threats, etc., if that's been amplified. I'm not familiar with how things change when, you know, the story is really becoming national and it's
there's been a sea change in of course there's I don't mean to say that a ton of stuff doesn't need to happen there, you know, like the Me Too movement in general. Hopefully we're just at the very beginning of a giant cultural change that needs to happen, but there has been a bit of a cultural shift in gymnastics. For example, when Jen Say published her book on this topic, a memoir that she wrote in 2008, she was just brutalized in the gymnastics community. She was excommunicated. She had gymnasts, former and current elite gymnasts, writing her to, you know, kind of just excoriate her, kind of, you know, her book and her message. What she says now, 12 years later, that's just not happening. Like now, generally, when gymnasts stepped up and say something happened to me, I was a victim of Nassar, or I had a coach who abused me, generally they are being supported by their fellow gymnasts. That part, thankfully, has turned around, and it is partly due to the work of the Indianapolis Star and the survivors who stepped up in this case. We believe that this was kind of a tipping point moment. That will eventually, hopefully, lead to more change. But I think for Maggie, it's been generally very positive, right, Bonni? I mean, she has a lot of support from the gymnastics community.
She does, yeah. She's also, you know, she's coaching right now. Also, she's interested in doing a lot of work in sort of positive coaching space. You know, I think she's also grown a lot from this experience. I think having the film out and sort of being out front about everything that's been happening to her has matured her significantly. And she has very supportive parents, which is key to the success of a sexual assault victim. Having family support, having people that believe you, having people that continue to want to seek justice for you. But just to sort of put a point on this, none of the civil cases for any of these gymnasts has been settled yet. And John Manley, as John was talking about John Manley is responsible for all the civil cases with this guy, with Nassar. And there have been, you know, a couple of things settled with Michigan State, but, you know, not with the individual gymnast. So that continues. And it's unclear how that's going to resolve.
I have a couple of just sort of pragmatic documentary filmmaking questions, because we see video of Nassar's initial police interview, and then we also see him when he's been cuffed. And I'm just curious, what exactly legally is required to get access to that footage?
We put a FOIA request in, and we were also working with the investigator, Andrea Mumford, at the Michigan State Police Department. That tape of his from 1997 is a matter of public record. And, you know, we just, often things are of public record, but they mysteriously disappear, or nobody can put their finger on it, or, you know, there's like you're going on some ridiculous treasure hunt to try and find it. She was very she was very helpful in getting that to us. But yeah, we put in a FOIA to be able to use that.
That's if your students don't know, that a Freedom of Information Act was a law that Congress passed that allows the media, journalists, people, U.S. citizens to get access to discovery type material that police and other organizations have in criminal investigations.
And it's the depositions, the police material, the other material of Nasser, where that stuff that he has of himself explaining his medical treatments and such. Some of that had been on his YouTube channel. Other tapes had been, taken from his home. It was all very tricky for us because of the ongoing civil cases. So we had to really navigate what we could and couldn't use to stay true to the ongoing legal work that these lawyers were doing with the gymnasts.
Tell us also, if you can, about filming in the courtroom, because I can imagine that was a pretty packed environment. And how many would you say of there's a number thrown out there, something close to 500 people who came forward would have had the opportunity to testify or give a statement at the end as part of the plea deal. And was that in fact a very large number, or did we see the majority of those who spoke at the end?
The number actually is a fascinating thing. Angela Povolitis, who's the prosecutor in Michigan that was assigned to this case, had a bit of history with doing victim impact statements before sentencing, and part of her deal that they offered Nasser in his prosecution was to lessen some charges so that they would have the opportunity to have the survivor speak out in court. And when they made that announcement, many stepped forward right away. But even as it went public and it was on TV, more and more gymnasts kind of raised their hand and said, hey, wait a minute, I want to go to Michigan and participate in this. So the number kept growing. I'm embarrassed. I don't know what the exact number was by the end, but I believe it was in the couple of hundred range.
It was 230-ish.
Yeah, and then there are, you are correct that there are eventually, after Nasser was put away, they kept coming forward, and I think it is up to 500 now that have come forward. We actually were not in the courtroom. There was a pool camera. There was actually for a long time we tried to figure out how to cover it, and we were told that there was a pool camera that was allowed in, and then we realized that actually it was 3 angles. That's why you have these nice angles of Nasser and the wide shot of the room and the judge and all that, and of course the survivors themselves as they speak. So we were just very careful to make sure that we were on top of getting all that, and it was actually multiple courtrooms that this happened in over about a 6-week period. So it was just our great producer, actually, Saren Marshall, staying on top of the logistics of how that technically got done and getting us the footage as quickly as possible.
I have to say, I'm not someone who traditionally watches a lot of gymnastics, but the footage that you pulled is incredible. And I'm watching the film in awe of what they're doing, and then also in horror of not even the sexual abuse, but the physical and mental abuse that the girls are going through. And it makes me have a very complicated relationship to watching them perform. And I mean, their athleticism is incredible. How is your own relationship to the sport of gymnastics, having heard about, like, not specifically the sexual assault component of the story, which is so evil that the courts even acknowledge it, but the part that doesn't really get prosecuted, just the abuse in general?
I mean, I have to say, like, I grew up as a gymnast. I was not very good. I did gymnastics all the way through high school, but I was one of those girls who entered the gym because I had seen Nadia perform her perfect tens in 1976, and I had never seen. I wanted to do that. I wanted to fly through the air. I wanted to figure out how to have that experience. Of course, you know, whatever version of it ended up happening, but and every 4 years, I watch gymnastics religiously. I like you describe, you know, Jon and I both are just in awe of the athleticism, and we really tried hard in the film to honor that, to really bring honor and respect to the just absolute magnificence of these women and girls and what they are capable of doing. I would say our example of the sort of best anecdote in the film that sort of gets at both of these sort of the dissonance of these feelings is the Kerri Strug vault in London, because she's amazing. Like you see that kind of an athlete once in a lifetime sometimes. She's just an absolutely extraordinary person and athlete, and she had this opportunity her vault was the deciding factor in winning gold for Team USA. And once Jen Say started to make us sort of reanalyze what we were looking at, as she ran down for that second vault on a broken ankle and does, win gold for Team USA, and Bella Caroli scoops her up and tells her to wave to the crowd, and it's this glorious celebrated moment. Once we looked at it through the eyes of someone who was analyzing the psychological and physical abuse of this sport, it was hard to feel celebratory. And so what we're trying to do now is balance the respect and awe that we feel for the athleticism, while also trying to advocate for change in the gyms. Because as you find out with Maggie Nichols' success at the end of the film, you don't have to be coached in an abusive manner to be a successful athlete. There are other ways, and there are so many brilliant coaches working in the world today that are not performing abuses on their athletes. So, bringing attention to that so that we can once again reclaim the love of watching the sport is the goal. That's the goal.
I want to take questions from the audience, and I just want to quickly walk through our process. If you could place your question in the Q&A box, I'll call on you individually, and then I'll invite you individually to become panelists temporarily. At that point, you can turn on your video if you'd like to, if you're camera ready, or if not, just use your microphone to ask your question. We have a few already, so let me go ahead and start with, well, actually, the first one isn't really a question. So let me go over to Hillary. So Hillary, I'm going to move you over, and then again, you're welcome to use your camera or just your mic.
Hi there. I'll stay off camera, not quite camera ready. So thank you so much, both of you, for speaking with us tonight. I'm a former summer program student, and I'm in Canada right now.
Yes.
So I'm very happy to be able to join these events during a time where I couldn't be in Los Angeles. My question is about the experience of making the film for you folks. And is making a film like this with a topic that's so serious and should be so serious, is there enjoyment in making the film? And when you're doing interviews with these athletes and their families, is there positivity, is there laughter when the camera stops rolling? Thanks again.
It's a great question.
Well, of course, Bonni and I love making documentaries. So we caught the bug many years ago, and we keep doing it. It's really an incredible way to live one's life, because you just have the opportunity to get close to people, talk to them about usually the most important thing that's going on in their life. And in this case was no different, getting to know the various people that we interviewed with. There was fun. I think pretty much everybody we had some fun with, right? I mean, it's intense because, interviewing the survivors themselves, we're asking them to retell a story that is triggering for them. But oftentimes we found that because we were kind of coming to them wanting to listen and wanting to get the facts right and wanting to do justice to their story, that actually put many of the survivors at ease. And I think they were able to kind of sink into it and deliver the story with the kind of details and emotion without worrying about, you know, where this was going to end up, because I think they had confidence that it was going to be used for something good, so to speak. And of course that can lead to a bit of a catharsis, and catharsis can lead to actually a warm feeling in general, which leads to a good time. We also had a lot of good times with the newspaper folks. You know, we had a really good time in Indianapolis covering the Indy Star process. Their process is sort of a cousin of documentary filmmaking in a way. So we could kind of talk shop with them and go out for drinks at the end of the day and just sort of enjoy the work that we were doing together. So yeah, there's some dark moments, of course, because you're dealing with just sort of the darkest of things, but it's not without a lot of really warm moments as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hillary.
Thank
you. Sorry, I have a question from Catherine, so I'll move you over.
There, I'm unmuted. Hi.
Hi.
Well, I have so many questions. I watched the film this afternoon. I've been a big gymnastics fan. Until this year, I'd regularly go to UCLA to see the scholar athletes. And now I don't know about watching World Championship or Olympic level, because all the exposés I saw in the past about the Corelli farm, all the girls would cop to is, oh, I sneaked off and got a cheeseburger. They never talked about the hitting. But during that whole thing with Martha getting the final vote on the committee, it seems like Penny had to be pulling her strings, because the only excuse she had for not doing appointing Maggie was that she said they needed someone on balance beam. But Maggie was great on balance beam. So I thought, you know, maybe you had a little bit more to that story. But the thing that really bugged me that the parents weren't saying was, we asked Penny for the lead investigator's contact info, you know, and why didn't they keep pressing him? Maybe they did, but I didn't see it come through in the film that, you know, they should have asked for an analyst to come. Here's the date she saw Masser, you know, here's our diaries, here's our calendars. And was there no forensic investigation at all?
These are all excellent questions. And I want to just have you consider something for a minute. So these are all questions that we considered in the film, and there are answers to these questions. They're not definitive answers because there was a lot left still kind of unknown. And, you know, certainly the Nichols family has a great case to build against USA Gymnastics. We wanted to raise some of that in the film, but we really can't prove anything exactly. And what I really want to kind of concentrate on about what you said is that the Nichols, you have to understand, this is a family that since Maggie was 6 years old, they had a relationship with USA Gymnastics. And she excelled from the time she was, like, immediately. By the time she was 10, 11, she was an amazing gymnast. She was headed right for the national team. It is there are so many families around this country and around the world who put their kid into a sport and they think, all right, my kid's going to go all the way, you know. Maggie really had that potential, and they had a relationship with USA Gymnastics. They had a relationship with the coaches. But you have to balance, if you're really going to be in that system, you have to balance how far you're going to go in, asking the difficult questions and doing the investigation when you're also trying to get your daughter onto the Olympic team.
Right.
So they actually, as a family, went super far. They pushed and they pushed. They were not getting very many answers. But you have to think about also that balance of what they were dealing with. They were trying to put trust in USA Gymnastics, in the US Olympic Committee, in all of these organizations that we all put our trust in for our best athletes to perform in. And there was this horrible thing going on. So what do you do as parents? I think that, so we wanted to raise those questions that they were asking in the film, raise the possibility that maybe Maggie was held off the team because they were involved in this investigation and the FBI, et cetera. But I don't know if it does anybody any good right now to try and,
Well, it seems definite. And I mean, I watched the deliberations because they were televised, and it still made no sense to me at the time that they wouldn't pick someone as strong in all around as Maggie was.
Right.
And maybe it was Madison who was the expert on the balance beam, but
it was actually bars, and it was Madison who was an expert on bars.
Okay.
UCLA, Madison Cohen. And, you can make a justification for anything, right? Of course, but we all know, looking at this, and certainly looking at Maggie's NCAA career, when, by the way, she competed against many Olympic athletes who ended up in the NCAA and beat them all. We did the best we could to create a balanced interpretation of what had happened.
We spent a lot of time thinking about what was right, and could Maggie, what kind of case did she have against Marta, so to speak, and the other members of the team that chose the Olympic team in that year. And it's really kind of it's like a Talmudic discussion, because at the end of the day, gymnastics is a sport that's judged, and because of that, and you could argue that sports shouldn't be judged. Maybe there's another way to measure success in gymnastics, but the way it is that people sit there on the sideline and they make judgments about tricks, so to speak, that are done by the athletes, and they make strategic judgments about what will make a team more or less strong for this or that competition. And there was, as Bonni said, there is an argument that even a lot of experienced people in gymnastics way above our pay grade see the justification for leaving Maggie off the team. What people can seem to be pretty universal on in the gymnastics world is the total confusion about why she wasn't offered an alternate position on the team. That seemed unjustifiable to almost anybody who knows about.
Universally, that was considered unjustifiable. Yeah, that's right. Thank you for your question. It's excellent.
Yeah, great questions.
Oh, thanks for your answers.
So maybe just on that note, as a way to wrap up, considering what you were just talking about, like sort of making decisions and sort of deciding on certain things. Oh wait, sorry, there's another question that came in. Okay, well, I'll ask this and then I'll turn it over to Esther to give us a final question. Can you talk about anything that you had to leave out maybe late in the process that was a significant piece of the story but just didn't work for the overall flow of the documentary?
Well, one key thing that we mentioned in the film, but we actually shot a whole sequence that didn't make it in, is when the Indianapolis Star reporters were introduced to this story. They were working on a piece about child abuse that had happened in the Indianapolis schools, and in that case, there was a lawyer that gave Marissa Kwiatkowski a tip about this thing that was going on at USA Gymnastics, and the tip was that there's a case going on in Georgia, near Savannah, Georgia, where a parent had complained to USA, or they went to USA Gymnastics with a question about a specific coach. I've heard rumors that this coach has some checkered history, and USA Gymnastics said, As far as we know, he's a coach in good standing. That coach went on to abuse her young daughter. And then it turns out USA Gymnastics did know that he had been abusing other girls at other gyms for years, and he's now serving basically a life sentence. So during that case, this very clever lawyer, Brian Cornwell, figured out by deposing Steve Penny, the president of USAG, and other past presidents, that USAG essentially had a policy of not investigating sexual assault. And it seemed pretty obvious to him that the reason they weren't is because that could sully their reputation for their sponsors if they outed coaches that were involved in sexual assault. And so we had shot this great sequence. Brian is a great guy, and he was very generous with giving us access to his legal documents and video depositions. And it just turned out in the film, it really got in the way because it delayed the amount of time before we got to the survivors, Rachel and Jamie and Jessica and Maggie. And it was just one of those kind of darlings that we had to leave on the edit room floor. And our heart kind of hurts because we had a great relationship with Brian, and it was the case that in many ways started this whole thing. So that's probably the most significant example of something that we had to leave out.
All right, I'm going to bring over Esther, who's got the last question. So Esther, if you want to turn on your video, it'd be great to see you. But as you know, you can just use your mic too.
Hi, everyone. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I had such a blast today. Everything was just so informative, and I appreciate just the generosity you guys had in answering everything. The question I have is for Bonni. I found it very interesting you had personal experience growing up as a gymnast. So what I was wondering was, do you think that helped you ask more nuanced questions or notice things more that perhaps someone who wasn't familiar with the sport might have missed? Because as documentarians, I think we all have that instinct to follow up on a question or dig deeper, but I wondered if your knowledge of the sport helped you kind of find those moments a bit more clearly.
Definitely. Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, if I think about how to best answer that, I think what I could understand was the culture of obedience. Like if you start to get into a sport seriously, especially an individual sport versus a team sport like gymnastics or figure skating, I actually did both as a kid. Even if you're not top level, you understand conceptually, you start to take in that, the coach tells you how it is, you listen to the coach, you do what the coach says. If you don't do what the coach says, you don't get to perform in meets, you don't get better, you don't do I could start to understand how that's like, having experienced a little bit of that, I could understand how that psychology at a higher level really got into the blood and the veins of these girls. And when something really bad started to happen to them, whether that was, well, I don't care how injured you are, you need to compete on that broken ankle, or there's this doctor who's going to do something inappropriate to you, but you're not really going to question it because your coach said to go in there and see him. I could start to make those connections because I understood the kind of psychological and cultural norms of what that felt like. I didn't experience anything as dramatic as that, but it really helped me identify with the girls and the women. And both Jen Say and Tracy Talavera, who are both in the film, are from my era. I mean, Tracy Talavera was on the team with Mary Lou Retton. She was an idol of mine. And I, meeting her alone was just unbelievably fantastic. But just, being of that same age and experience, I think was also incredibly helpful.
Well, thank you. I think what was great about the doc was, I think for a lot of people, they have that question of like, how could this happen? Or how could the parents or the athletes themselves go this far without, I guess, complaining? But I think, both, you and Jon, like after I watched it, I felt like I really understood. And that's why I love the documentary so much. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Bonni, Jon, thank you both so much for spending this evening with us to talk about this really important testament to everything that these survivors went through and all of the work that's still to be done, particularly in these cases. I mean, the fact that there are all of these civil suits that need to be decided, I'm really glad that the world knows about their stories.
Well, thank you so much for having us. It's been a great conversation, and really love the questions and the depth of what we've done here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for this opportunity. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you so much.